Well, I hope George Griffin does not need any introduction, and I hope that most of you are familiar with my article about him in the Mark Twain Journal. That article of 20,000 words has grown into a book of a little more than 100,000 words with 170 words, works that are cited, very few of which are familiar to Twainians. About 650 endnotes, about 300 pages, about 43 illustrations, and 5 chapters. The first chapter deals with his 12 years of enslavement as a child, his 5 years of service in the American Civil War, his 8 years of training and schooling following the Civil War, his 17 years with the Clemens family, and his final 6 years as a waiter with the Union League Club in New York City. The final 2 chapters of the book, there are 7 chapters in all, one is a forensic analysis of a photograph that I will show you, analyzing what the photograph shows us, what it doesn't, and what it means, and a chapter on Huckleberry Finn where I trace the paternal elements of Jim's character directly from George Griffin's paternal position in the Clemens household, which I consider to be the most important element of Jim's character because it brings about the go-to-hell moment on which the book's success stands. Here's George Griffin. As he was depicted in a movie in 1944, he's been described as a womanizer, a court jester, a master of deceit, greedy, a buffoon, and a loan shark. He was none of those things. And I can't help but think that the white scholars who described him using those words might have used different words had George been a white Butler. There's the photograph I discovered toward the end of 2023. Sitting on the porch in Hartford. We'll move in and look at that photograph a little closer. On the far side over there, you will see Lizzie Wills, a.k.a. Whapping Alice. There she is, Kumi in the flesh. Mary McAleer, Patrick McAleer's wife, the coachman, is sitting in the foreground. She's about 6 or 7 months pregnant with her son, Henry. The woman closest to me is Mary McLaughlin, and she is 6 feet tall with raven hair, a swarthy complexion, looks like Cleopatra, and Twain called her a superb creature to look at. Moving back to George Griffin, his first enslaver was this man, Walter Griffin. And that is Walter Griffin's census showing his wife and his daughter, Ida, who later married a first cousin of Samuel Mudd, Dr. Samuel Mudd. Walter Griffin's slave schedule shows a 1-year-old male, and I believe that to be George Griffin, not because you can read that from that record, but because of some other circumstantial evidence with it. This is the home that Walter Griffin lived in, where George Griffin would have trained as a house servant, as was customary in Maryland at that time. It was located near Piscataway. It's where his wife and Dr. Samuel Mudd's first cousin later moved. His second enslaver lived just about 3 miles down the road from Walter Griffin. She filled out a document listing 8 members of the Griffin family. It's a very faint document. I had to filter it and enlarge it and play with it to get it as clear as possible. But if you look in the middle, you see a George Griffin. It is extremely rare to find a document naming a slave. George Griffin, by the way, is the only black man born in Maryland in any records in 1849. So we can be pretty sure that this George Griffin is our George Griffin, and the close association of her living just down the road from Walter Griffin, who may have been George Griffin's father because he described himself as biracial, is even stronger evidence that we are talking about the same man. They live close to Piscataway, Maryland, not New Jersey. In the center of this picture, right here, is a hotel. Over here is Walter Griffin's father. I hope that doesn't make my butt look big. Walter Griffin lived a little bit outside of Piscataway, as did his second enslaver. That hotel was a hangout for all the spies, smugglers, and insurrectionists who lived in Maryland at that time. It was a border state, and there was a lot of sympathy for the South in southern Maryland. That's the whole region. There is Piscataway, Walter Griffin up here. Mary Surratt, one of the Lincoln conspirators, lived just up the road from Walter Griffin. The son, and Walter Griffin, by the way, partnered with another man, George Hunter, who lives right here, and they bought that hotel in Piscataway, which was described as the resort of active spirits by its original owner, who, by the way, was also a Booth conspirator. The son of the second enslaver of Walter Griffin helped Booth escape after the assassination, where he escaped through Maryland, right through Piscataway in this area. And of course, I mentioned the Griffin and the Mudd families were married, related by marriage, and I'll mention something else later on. Here's that hotel. It still stands today, but this is what it looked like in 1936. George Griffin left before the conspirators got busy with their plans to kill Abraham Lincoln, but it tells, the reason it's interesting to note those people's activities is because it tells us they were not merely enslavers. They were traitors to their country, they were spies, they were smugglers, they were reprehensible people up and down. George Griffin became the body servant for this man, General Charles Devens. The duties of a body servant were loading and unloading wagons, pitching tents, serving meals, polishing boots, grooming the horses, ironing and washing clothes, nursing the sick and wounded, burying the dead, usually doing the grave digging. When General Devens' troops came from Baltimore and into Washington, they left Washington, camped in an area just north of Piscataway, and right at that time, this man right here, Lieutenant Richard Derby, one of the junior officers, wrote to his family saying, "We have acquired the services of a nice colored boy who knows his business to the letter." He doesn't name him, but I believe that that may be our George Griffin. Twain wrote about Griffin that he saw his share of the war all through the war. And I'll mention that the Colonel, Devens at that time, was in charge of a regiment. He would have been the first guy in the regiment to lay claim to any body servant that came into that regiment. The commander of a regiment was not going to be doing all the duties of a body servant. That was for buck privates and junior officers. General Devens led his troops into 5 different battles in the Civil War. Ball's Bluff is where they tried to cross the Potomac, and they were repulsed by the rebels who had rifles. The Union troops had smoothbore muskets, which were less accurate. Over 1,000 of the 1,700 Union troops were casualties in that battle. They were either killed, wounded, or drowned in the river and never found, missing in action. And there were no doubt some deserters. At Ball's Bluff, General Devens, who led from the front, not from the back, was wounded. He later went on to Seven Pines. He was wounded again. He fought at Antietam. He had his horse shot out from under him. They fought at Chancellorsville. He was wounded a 3rd time. Remember that George Devens is his body servant caring for those wounds after each of those battles. His final battle was at Cold Harbor, a grim, terrible battle. He was carried on a stretcher on the battlefield. George Griffin, very likely, if custom was followed, would have been one of those stretcher bearers. Let's remember that he was 12 to 16 years old. As the war progressed, he was tall and very strong. After Cold Harbor, they were unable to bury all of the dead. They came back a year later and picked up the dead off the battlefield and buried them. They dug up a few of them that had been buried in shallow graves. Clara Barton was a friend of General Devens and showed up after 2 of these battles to help nurse the wounded under fire. Devens was also a friend of General Sickles during the war, and the year after the war, he went down and second in command for the Southern District of Charleston, South Carolina, where the whole Civil War began in the first place, and served a year there. Afterward, he went back to Worcester, and I'll get to that. Toward the end of the war, he was the first Union general to lead Union troops into Richmond, the Confederate capital. He took over the Confederate White House, where Jeff Davis had been, established that as his headquarters. Who should show up 2 days later but President Lincoln and his son Tad? General Devens hosted a 30-minute luncheon for President Lincoln. They brought a bottle of whiskey up from the cellar. All the soldiers there in the house had whiskey. Abraham Lincoln and General Devens had water. We might remember that George Griffin did not drink, did not smoke, did not curse. General Devens would not allow any of his troops to drink whiskey. I cannot prove that General Devens' body servant George served that glass of water to Lincoln, but I can be pretty sure that George Griffin saw or met Abraham Lincoln and his son when they visited, and his commanding officer hosted that luncheon. Lincoln then got in a carriage and took a tour of Richmond, and a young black man hopped on the front of the carriage. That's Lincoln, that's Devens, we can tell that by his hat, and a young black man driving the horses on the tour of the city. 2 weeks later, Lincoln was assassinated. When authorities were desperately trying to find Booth, they got 2 tips that were of many, hundreds of tips, even thousands of tips. One of those tips was from a rebel prisoner who had been a member of the Union Army but joined the Confederacy and was jailed for treason. He said, if you're looking for Mary Surratt's son, John, search Walter Griffin's farm. They also got a tip from a woman in Washington, D.C., who reported unusual activity at Mary Surratt's tavern, where Booth and his conspirators had met. She also had her boarding house near 5 miles north of Piscataway. And that woman said, you need to go out there and search it. The authorities did. They arrested Mary Surratt. They found Lewis Powell, 2 of the 4 people who were hanged for their part in the conspiracy. Did I mention that that woman was a black woman, and did I mention that her name was Griffin? After the war, General Devens retired to the city he came from, Worcester, Massachusetts. I believe that's how they say it there, and I've been there many times. He became a boarder at the Bay State House, and George Griffin he became a boarder at the Bay State House, and George Griffin became a waiter there. He also went to night school. I've identified the school that I think he went to, which was just 2 blocks away. There's the dining room where he would have worked in the Bay State House. It is where General Devens, who was a good friend of General Grant, hosted a dinner for General Grant after Grant was elected president in 1869. The 2 old comrades, battle-tested comrades, met at that dinner. I cannot prove that George Griffin was their waiter, but I suspect he probably was. George Griffin had saved $425 during his time in Worcester, and he went to school, and he moved to Hartford, where he got married, and married this woman, Rhoda Hayes. But that wasn't really her name. Her name was Rhoda Hayes Miro. She presented herself as a widow. She was not. She was a divorcee, and her husband accused her and George Griffin of having an affair. However, there is no evidence that George Griffin was ever aware that she was a divorcee or had any part in that. We just don't know, and I've looked at the divorce papers, it's hard to tell. Based on her later behavior, I suspect he did not, knowing everything we know about his not drinking, not smoking, not cursing, and being a church deacon. It would seem out of character if he had known. Her behavior later on was atrocious. She deserted him in 1884, and he waited the prescribed period of time and divorced her in 1889. While in Hartford, he became a deacon in the AME Zion Church. He also became a private banker and a professional gambler, not a loan shark. He opened a cafe in partnership with a man named Packard, who I've not been able to trace. And he was offended by the attentions of bold women. Whenever he went out, he was a tall and handsome man, and he called those women bold, very bold. He went to work at Allen House, where President Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Twain gave his lecture on accident insurance. Also Horace Greeley and Reverend Henry Ward Beecher had spoken. George Griffin worked there as a waiter. He then joined this family. There's Livy, there's Clara standing, there's Jean sitting, there's Susie sitting over to the side, there's Flash the dog, and then there's a guy smoking a cigar. George Griffin's room in the mansion right up here. He had a clear view around the corner of the servants' quarters. He could eavesdrop on anybody that came to the front door. While working there, he would have met the following people who visited the home and had dinner: Elisha and Frank Bliss, James R. Osgood, Henry M. Stanley the Explorer, Edward Everett Hale, Joe Twitchell, Harry Beecher Stowe, who lived next door, William Dean Howells, Thomas Bailey Aldrich, Joel Chandler Harris, William Gillette the actor, Charles Webster, Orion and Jane Clemens, who visited, Susan Crane, Mrs. Langdon's, Livy's mother, Joe Goodman from Nevada, Governor Hawley, and Charles Dudley Warner, and William Wright, a.k.a. Dan DeQuille. There's George Griffin's room. It is 21 feet long, 12 feet wide for 2/3 of its length, and 8 feet wide for the other. Has a very pitched roof. It's easy to walk around in if you get permission from the staff there, which I did. It's not a small, cramped room that most servants had, and he was not in the servants' quarters of the house. His room was directly above the bedroom of Sam and Olivia Clemens. That's his view out the door, looking down at the front. He could look out and had a clear view of the driveway, at least when the trees were not in full bloom. So he got to see everything. He liked to gamble at the local horse tracks. I've identified that track, the Charter Oak Park, as one where he would have won $800 in Hartford during the racing season there. It's the most likely horse track where he could have won that much money. The other racetracks near Hartford were much smaller, didn't offer those kind of winnings. There are horses crossing the finish line. They were in little sulkies that went about 40 miles an hour. If an axle broke or you fell out, you were going to be grievously injured or killed. It was a lot more fun for the horses than it was for the drivers. He also gambled at the Rochester Driving Park. That's a map of their big 1 mile track. He won $1,500 there. We're talking real money. You multiply these numbers by about 30 to get an idea of the kind of money George Griffin was making. Much more than he ever earned as a butler. And there they are, the horses at least, having fun, crossing the line at the Rochester Driving Park. There are 2 new documents that pertain to George Griffin that are worth pointing out. A Page stock certificate. I have 2. The Hartford home has 1. I don't know if they ever found the one that they have. It's somewhere in their archives. This demonstrates, because Twain filled it out in his hand and he had George Griffin and Olivia sign it as witnesses. He could have had Harry Beecher Stowe, Charles Dudley Warner, the governor of Connecticut, Joe Twitchell, or any number of people sign as a witness, but he had George Griffin sign it, which is an indication of the level of trust and authority, stature that George Griffin had in that household. The second document makes the same point. It says, "True bliss, a friend," not true blue, it reads true bliss, which is a religious connotation about pure love, platonic love, godly love, non-physical love. Remember, we're talking about an AMEZ church deacon. There are 2 autograph albums that are signed by all 5 members of the Clemens family, that is, Sam, Olivia, and all 3 daughters, and both of those are also signed by George Griffin. They're also signed by other people, but the 6 signatures that appear in those 2 unique autograph albums include all 5 Clemenses and George Griffin. He was considered a member of the family, and there's repeated evidence that he was treated that way, viewed that way during his life and after his death. I own that one. The other one is at New York Public Library. Same day that George Griffin wrote his little inscription, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote one of her own, which is a little more prescriptive. Trust in the Lord and do good, kind of a finger shaking, very prescriptive. After the Clemenses moved to Europe in 1891, George Griffin moved to New York, and he married a woman he had met in Hartford, Mary Amelia Washington. They had 3 children, Clara, who was named after, well, you know who, George Jr. Both of those children died in infancy of respiratory illnesses. He never got to be a paternal figure to his own 2 children. His 3rd son, Lucius, however, was born 2 months before George himself died. Lucius died in 1910, very shortly before Mark Twain did. George never got to be a paternal figure to Lucius either. George gave interest-free loans to his fellow workers who wanted loans to take care of their children. It's a real tragedy. that he was a paternal figure to the Clemens sisters, never to his own children for any reasonable length of time. But he was a kind-hearted man and did the right thing by his friends who needed money for their kids. He and his wife lived in an 8-story tenement building, a brick building in New York City, about halfway between 8th and 9th Avenues on West 330, West 37th Street. If he walked 2 blocks up to 39th Street and took a right and walked 3 blocks down to 5th Avenue, he would come out at this corner at the Union League Club. He'd come walking up 39th Street, turn the corner and go in the entrance, and that's where the Union League Club was located during the years George Griffin worked there. Who would he have met there? He would have met Teddy Roosevelt, who was a frequent guest for lunch when he was a police commissioner in New York, Albert Bierstadt, the artist, Frederick Remington, William McKinley, Frederick Laws Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, Thomas Nast, J.D. Rockefeller, and Henry Rogers. These are people that may be familiar to some of you who have studied Twain. After his death, at the time of his death, he had $8,000 net worth. His widow, Mary Washington, see her at the top of their son Lucius appear in the 1900 census. She was only able to gain access to 2 of his 3 bank accounts for about $675. He had about $300 or $400 in cash in the household. She never gained access to the safe at the Union League Club, which contained everything that he had that was collateral for his outstanding loans. So she only gained access to roughly $1,000 of his $8,000 estate. The lawyer that represented her pro bono was a member of the Union League Club. He repeatedly petitioned the Tammany Hall surrogate judge, who dragged his feet and finally signed the documents, and that's all she got. I don't think that her lawyer ripped her off. I think the Tammany Hall surrogate judge did, and I have a section about that in the book. She then went to work at the Henrietta School, which was a refuge for women who were at risk, and her son was too young to be enrolled, but he could have been a charity case there. She moved back to Hartford a few years later, died there in 1937, destitute, and her son Lucius and she are both buried in Hartford in graves that are marked at that time. That brings us back to George Griffin in 1944, or the George Griffin of 1875. You can take your choice. You know what my choice is. I think that George Griffin, along with Daniel Quarles and John T. Lewis and Marianne Cord and many other black voices, all influenced the character of Jim, but I think that George Griffin was the most important. He was with Mark Twain 24/7 for 17 years, with the exception of the Twain Cable Tour, 1 year in Europe, at times when Twain was away on business. He had tremendous influence by his example and his position in the household and as a paternal figure to the Clemens daughters, which I document at length in the book. No time here to go into all of that. I believe George Griffin was the lucky man to have known Mark Twain, but I think Mark Twain was the luckier man. George Griffin would have succeeded in life. He would have been successful. He was a networker. He was highly social. He was smart as a whip, and he would have gone far with or without Samuel Clemens. But would Mark Twain have been able to write his masterpiece and put the hero, not Huck Finn, the hero, Jim, who makes that book work, who makes that book the masterpiece that it is? And I say no. Without George Griffin, he could not have done it, because George Griffin supplied the key ingredient to the recipe that brings that book its success as the, I don't think I think the great American novel. So I say thank you, Mr. Griffin, and thank you for listening.